Oh hey, you're into sword fighting too, right? Maybe we can train together sometime?
Which manuscripts have you practiced?
Actually, I did Kendo and Kali for a couple of years. Figured maybe we can kind of compare the different approaches and learn from one another.
Look, why don't you go find a local LARP group or something? If you want to learn real sword fighting, you can come back.
You may remember the video I put up a couple of weeks ago about how to tell if someone knows swordsmanship, which was a direct reply to Combat Outlook, and I actually got a response via email from the creator of the channel, which by the way was perfectly rational and respectful. I'm not going to quote anything directly from that because it was a private email conversation, but just to paraphrase one thing that he pointed out is that he's met a lot of people from different martial arts and has of course met good and bad people. In short, you know, those who are a little bit more diligent in their presentation than those who are more on the elitist side. And so that led me to think about the topic of, is HEMA elitist? My first instinct is to point out the diversity in just about any community, and that you can't really make sweeping broad statements about they are all such and such. But then I thought about it some more, you know, just thinking the HEMA community overall in terms of averages and tendencies and whatnot. And I have to say, yes, there is definitely a certain level of elitism, you know, based on my personal experience. Because this is a rather inflammatory topic, I'm just going to be showing you some nice, relaxing footage from a trip to a beach to balance it a little thematically, I suppose, and perhaps help cool down some hot tempers. So some instructors particularly definitely take things very, very seriously. I'm not going to name any names, but there's a few people, but one person in particular that I have in mind who really wants everything to be as professional as possible. Who's in favor of a universal style for HEMA gear, you know, basically everything all black and kind of standardized. Doesn't even like any historical outfits, particularly the poofy, colorful Renaissance pants, and wants to really distinguish HEMA and avoid any kind of association with, you know, LARP or other more casual forms of sword fighting, I suppose. Focus on tournaments and, you know, athletic performance, etc., etc. That, in my opinion, is, I mean, it's one way to do it. I'm not going to tell any instructor and any founder of a HEMA school how to do it. It's their school. They can do whatever the fluff they want, and they can, you know, emphasize what they feel like. For me, that's not the way to go, personally. I actually like a more relaxed approach, or even somewhat casual, if you will, where, you know, I recognize that a lot of HEMA students are there for the fun, really, for the recreational aspect, because it's cool and interesting and all that. They're not looking to become gold-winning tournament fighters, basically. That's really a minority within the minority that is HEMA practitioners, and I think we should acknowledge that. So that's one aspect, not just the outward representation, but also how strict you are about organizational hierarchy, basically within the school or club. Whether you think a certain authority should come with a rank and how much, whether it's just within class or also applies to HEMA discourse outside of that school, etc. And then there's the aspect of how strict you want to be in the study of the historical sources. And there is definitely a certain amount of gatekeeping, I would say, in HEMA. The issue here, of course, as many have pointed out before, that the historical sources need to be interpreted, that there's a certain amount of trial and error, interpretation, testing, reinterpretation, and all that. Some are more diligent in that than others. Some overlook crucial aspects, for example, the importance of testing things in sparring. in particular. And some are very, very adamant that their particular interpretation of the sources is the only viable one, and everybody else is just goofing off or whatever is wrong. There's definitely some clash of egos involved. I've seen that a number of times on various HEMA Facebook groups where things get heated. It starts out as a discussion about a particular technique, a particular interpretation, sometimes individual people or schools or what have you. And then it sometimes escalates into personal attacks and, angry back and forth, bickering. I've definitely seen some frankly toxic examples in those groups in particular. On Facebook, it can get kind of ridiculous at times, in my opinion. I've certainly heard people badmouth rival schools, if you will. That's kind of a strong word, but that's clearly how they look at it. And I've also heard people badmouth other arts. Again, this happens everywhere. This also happens in Kendo, Kenjutsu, Chinese swordsmanship, and of course very much unarmed martial arts as well. So that's not unusual. Again, I'm talking general broad tendencies and some observations I've made. There are plenty of awesome people in the HEMA community who are very welcoming to new students, who are very open-minded in their discourse with other instructors and other practitioners, and who are open to cross-referencing, to basically comparing notes with other martial arts, who are open to trading with other sword fighters from other disciplines and backgrounds, all of that. There are plenty of people like that. And there are events like, for example, the Short Blade Symposium, where really everyone is welcome. You have HEMA, you have Filipino martial arts, you have African martial arts, you have a bunch of things. So people can just get together and spar and have fun and do it respectfully, exchange perspectives and all that, which is great. That's the kind of thing that I really like. And there could be more of that. Personally, I generally try to approach things with curious open-mindedness, with a healthy dose of skepticism mixed into it. Like, you shouldn't be so open-minded that you start accepting some bullshito that has never been tried and tested against a resisting opponent, things like that. There are certain things that sometimes I've been very skeptical and critical about certain things, maybe going a little too far sometimes, or not going far enough. It's not easy to hit that sweet spot, that just right middle ground between open-mindedness and skepticism. But I generally very much like to compare notes. That's how I tend to say it, just to see how others approach the same thing. Because fighting with a sword has certain fundamental universals. The human body, of course, poses a certain functional framework, meaning that certain techniques and movement patterns are simply biomechanically more efficient and are more effective in terms of how long it takes, how direct something is, how much force you can transmit, all the basics of martial arts in general. There are only so many ways you can move effectively and swing a sword effectively, but within that framework, there is still a lot of variation. There's still plenty of differences, and it's absolutely productive to take a peek at how others do it and see if you can take any kind of improvements for what you do yourself. Ideally, that's done without too much ego, with a constructive mindset where you're willing to consider that things are suboptimal that you've been doing. I mean, there's always room for improvement. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing something, there's always ways to improve. None of that means that it's unreasonable to set certain hard boundaries. For example, there's a certain group, and there may very well be more than one, that likes to practice with sharp blades and does it in both inefficient and unsafe ways. I've made a separate video about that. In cases like that, it's perfectly fair to say, no, I'm not going to bother with that. You do you, but it's ridiculous. Same if, for example, if you're dealing with someone who's hell-bent on proving that their swordsmanship is superior, and they have questionable ways of doing whatever it takes to claim victory, by using just flawed mechanics, it's reasonable to reject that. What I mean by that is, for example, the whole little tippy taps that I've talked about in previous videos. There's some nuance. It's one thing to land a cut on the hand, which really doesn't take much rotation in the cut and can also get away with less than perfect edge alignment, things like that. And it's something else entirely to do a little tippy tap with poor edge alignment on someone's torso and claim victory because you touched them. You know, I've definitely seen that happen in, again, different arts, not just HEMA, but in a bunch of different arts. So yes, you have to draw certain boundaries and you have to say what you're doing there just doesn't make sense. This wouldn't work. And you can argue for why you think it wouldn't work. That's all good. But you should still remain open to different arguments. You know, as long as the other person has arguments and isn't just trying to drown you out and just flood you with nonsensical claims. In short, dismissiveness and personal attacks are something we don't need, either in HEMA or in other communities. It happens everywhere, of course, because where there are humans, there is drama, and we are, quite frankly, garbage when it comes to live and let live and respecting others. You know, generally, we have a tribalistic mindset ingrained in our DNA, I suppose. So yeah, clobbering others and bad-mouthing them, and this is always going to happen, but we should minimize it as much as possible. So by all means, do invite conversations and practice with people from other backgrounds, other disciplines, other arts, even if it's not a single art. You know, sometimes some people puzzle things together. And it's kind of a multidisciplinary approach where they throw everything into a box and mix it up and see what works and what doesn't, which is totally fine. For example, if someone decided to create a group that's an amalgamation of European, Japanese, Filipino, Chinese, swordsmanship, whatever, hell yeah, go for it. I don't see anything wrong with it. Of course, there's a risk in spreading yourself too thin, but generally, it's a productive approach to compare with others and see what their perspective and approach is. With things like cutting mechanics, footwork, and everything, there's plenty of overlap and plenty of difference that you might be able to use for your personal progression. And finally, relax. I understand that some people work hard to try to give HEMA more gravitas, give it more credibility, have a very serious approach to it. That's okay, but you can't expect everybody to agree with that and do it the same way. At the end of the day, swordsmanship is no longer relevant. It's a very niche thing. It has become a lot more popular in recent decades, but it's not something that we need to defend our lives anymore. It's not a matter of life and death whether your interpretation is better than someone else's. And, points in HEMA tournaments and medals are great. Sure, it's a great accomplishment and you should be proud of it. But it's not the only thing. And, just because you have more medals than someone else doesn't mean that this other person has no clue what they're talking about, shouldn't even be touching swords or whatever. Who knows, maybe at some point HEMA might become an Olympic discipline. At which point, yes, athletes need to be serious about their training, of course. But not everybody needs to or wants to be an athlete, and some people just want to have fun with it, and that's all good. That's about it. So, thanks for listening to my long-winded rambles. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.